The notification appeared on Detective Maria Sanchez's computer screen at exactly 9:47 a.m. on a gray Monday morning in October 2024. After 14 years working cold cases for the Lynn County Sheriff's Department in Iowa, she had learned to recognize the weight of certain moments before they fully registered in her conscious mind. The CODIS database match had been sitting in her inbox for less than 2 minutes, but something about the case number made her pause. Novak, Ronald Lee. Murdered December 23, 1983. File last updated 2019. Sanchez leaned back in her chair, the fluorescent lights of the Cedar Rapids headquarters casting harsh shadows across the manila folders that perpetually cluttered her desk. 41 years. She had worked cases that stretched back decades, but nothing quite like this. In 1983, DNA was still a theoretical concept, locked away in university laboratories. The double helix had been decoded, but the idea that microscopic genetic material could solve crimes belonged to science fiction. Yet here, on her monitor, was irrefutable proof that Michael Shappert's DNA matched biological evidence collected from a 24-year-old man's brutal murder in rural Walker, Iowa, more than 4 decades ago. The match shouldn't have been possible. Shappert had never been arrested for a violent crime. His genetic profile had been entered into the system only in 2023, part of a massive cold case initiative that processed thousands of forgotten samples using new extraction techniques that could recover genetic material from fabric fragments and microscopic traces that previous technology couldn't detect. Sanchez pulled up Ronald Novak's file, watching the crime scene photographs load with agonizing slowness on her outdated system. A young face stared back at her from a driver's license photo taken just months before the murder. Ronald had been 24 years old, working odd jobs around Lynn County, living alone in a small rural house near Walker. He had been found by a friend on December 23, 1983, beaten, shot in the chest, his hands bound behind his back in an unheated room where shock and hypothermia had finished what violence had started. If you're following this investigation and want to see how modern forensic techniques are solving cases that seemed impossible to crack, subscribe to stay updated on breakthrough discoveries that are changing everything we thought we knew about cold cases. The original investigation file was thicker than most from that era, nearly 6 inches of reports, witness statements, and search documentation. Sheriff Thomas Blake had been thorough by 1983 standards, but the tools available to him were primitive compared to modern forensic capabilities. No cell phone records to trace, no security cameras to review, no social media footprints to follow, just physical evidence, witness testimony, and intuition. Sanchez found herself staring at the evidence inventory list, typed on an old manual typewriter, with letters that struck unevenly against the paper. Item 14. Unknown biological sample collected from victim's restraints. Item 15. Fabric fragments from binding material. Item 16. Blood evidence from multiple locations at scene, collected in evidence bags, 16A through 16F. What struck her was not what was listed, but what the original investigators couldn't have known. They were looking at those biological samples contained genetic material that would remain undetectable for another 25 years. The fabric fragments held traces of skin cells that would become the key to solving Ronald Novak's murder, but only after technologies that didn't exist in 1983 could finally read the story written in molecules invisible to the human eye. Ronald Lee Novak woke that December morning to the sound of wind rattling the thin windows of his rental house, located 5 miles outside Walker on what locals simply called County Road 7. The Iowa winter had arrived early that year, bringing temperatures that plunged to 15 degrees below zero at night and rarely climbed above freezing during the day. Everything about that day would later be dissected, analyzed, and remembered with the painful precision that comes only after normal moments become evidence in an investigation. Ronald had been what his sister Janet Wilson would later describe as a little elusive. At 24, he was developing the independent nature that often comes with young adulthood in rural areas, working construction jobs when he could find them, doing odd jobs for farmers during harvest season, and living the kind of low-key existence that attracted little attention in a county where everyone knew everyone else's business. He wore his favorite flannel shirt that morning, the red and black checked pattern that Janet had given him for Christmas the previous year. The house was small, barely more than a cabin, really, with an unheated back room that Ronald used for storage and a wood-burning stove in the main living area that struggled to keep the place warm during Iowa winters. Ronald's routine that December day should have been ordinary. He had planned to drive into Cedar Rapids to pick up his unemployment check, maybe stop by his sister's house for coffee, and return home before the temperature dropped too far after sunset. It was a journey he had made dozens of times, past farmland covered in snow, beyond the Morrison grain elevator with its faded paint, and into town where the rural silence yielded to the sounds of small city afternoon routines. The first indication that something was wrong came when Ronald failed to show up at Janet's house as planned. He had called her that morning around 9 a.m., his voice carrying the casual warmth that characterized their relationship. Janet had offered to make his favorite banana bread, and Ronald had promised to be there by 2 p.m. When 4 p.m. arrived with no sign of her brother and no phone call to explain his absence, Janet felt the first stirrings of concern. Ronald might be elusive about his social life, but he never missed family commitments without warning. Ronald's friend, David Martinez, discovered the body at 6:15 p.m. on December 23rd. Martinez had driven to Ronald's house after Janet called him, worried that her brother might have car trouble on the icy roads. What he found in that unheated back room would haunt him for the rest of his life. Ronald lay on the concrete floor, his hands bound behind his back, with what appeared to be electrical cord, a gunshot wound to his chest, and signs of severe beating around his head and face. The room was freezing, the door left open to the December night, and the evidence suggested that Ronald had been alive for some time after the initial assault, his body temperature dropping as shock and hypothermia claimed him. Martinez ran to his truck and drove at dangerous speeds through the icy darkness to the nearest house with a phone nearly a mile away. His voice shook as he reported what he'd found to the Lynn County Sheriff's Department dispatcher. Sheriff Thomas Blake, who had been preparing to end his shift and head home for Christmas Eve preparations with his family, found himself instead driving through the bitter cold toward a crime scene that would become the most complex investigation of his 18-year career. Sheriff Blake arrived at Ronald Novak's house at 7:03 p.m., his breath creating clouds in the frigid air as he approached the small structure. The scene inside was worse than Martinez's panicked phone call had suggested. This wasn't a simple robbery gone wrong. The level of violence, the deliberate binding, the gunshot wound all pointed to something more calculated, more personal. Blake had seen his share of violent deaths, farm accidents, hunting mishaps, domestic disputes that escalated beyond control. But standing in that freezing back room, looking at Ronald Novak's broken body, he understood immediately that this case was different. The initial investigation began within hours of Martinez's discovery. Blake assembled every available resource in Lynn County, his 5 full-time deputies, the volunteer fire department, and state police investigators, who arrived from Des Moines by 10 p.m. By midnight, the small house was swarming with personnel, their portable lights creating harsh shadows as they documented every detail of the crime scene. The terrain made investigating both straightforward and complex. The rural setting offered clear sight lines and limited escape routes, but the bitter cold had driven most residents indoors hours earlier, eliminating potential witnesses who might have seen vehicles or suspicious activity. The evidence collection that night would prove crucial, though it would take 41 years for its true significance to emerge. Crime scene technicians carefully photographed the electrical cord used to bind Ronald's hands, noting the distinctive knots and the way the binding had been secured. They collected blood samples from multiple locations, swabbed surfaces for fingerprints, and gathered fabric fragments that seemed inconsistent with Ronald's clothing. Most importantly, they discovered biological material on the restraints, microscopic traces of skin cells and blood that would eventually link Michael Schappert to this frozen room in rural Iowa. Janet Wilson insisted on identifying her brother's body, despite Blake's gentle suggestions that she remember Ronald as he had been in life rather than in death. Her anguished sobs created a soundtrack that would remain in investigators' memories for decades. The sound of a sister confronting the brutal reality that someone had not just killed Ronald, but had done so with a level of violence that suggested rage or desperation far beyond simple robbery. As the sun rose on December 24, 1983, Blake made the decision to expand the investigation beyond his department's immediate capabilities. The case had moved beyond routine police work into territory that required specialized expertise. State Police Detective Lieutenant Frank Murphy arrived from Des Moines at 8:30 a.m., bringing with him crime scene technicians and investigative protocols that would guide the next months of intensive work. Murphy was a methodical investigator who had worked several homicide cases in urban Des Moines, but the rural setting and apparent lack of witnesses presented unique challenges. The investigation revealed that Ronald's house showed signs of robbery. His small collection of cash, maybe $200 that he kept hidden in a coffee can, was missing. Several items that might have been sold for quick money had been disturbed or removed. But the level of violence suggested that something had gone wrong during the robbery, that confrontation had escalated into murder in ways that the perpetrators perhaps hadn't initially intended. Murphy established a command post in the Lynn County Sheriff's Department, installing additional telephone lines and coordinating with law enforcement agencies across Iowa and neighboring states. The search for suspects led investigators through the shadowy world of rural drug dealing and petty crime that existed beneath the surface of farming community respectability. Ronald, it emerged, had been known to sell small amounts of marijuana to friends and acquaintances, not as a major dealer, but as someone who helped others find what they wanted while making a little money to supplement his irregular construction work. This revelation opened new investigative avenues, but also complicated the case, creating a network of potential suspects who had reason to know that Ronald kept cash and drugs at his isolated house. Murphy documented everything meticulously, filling out reports in his careful handwriting and photographing potential evidence with the department's aging Polaroid camera. Every witness statement, every piece of physical evidence, every theory was cataloged and filed. Most would prove tangential to solving the case, but Murphy understood that missing details could mean the difference between justice and watching a murder fade into the archives of unsolved mysteries. By the end of January 1984, the intensive investigation had interviewed more than 150 people. They had checked the backgrounds of known drug users in the area, questioned everyone who had been seen at Ronald's house during the previous months, and followed up on dozens of tips from community members who thought they remembered seeing suspicious vehicles or hearing unusual sounds on the night of December 23rd. But as February arrived and no arrests were made, the investigation began its inevitable transition from active manhunt to cold case file. Janet Wilson's obsession began with small rituals that seemed reasonable to a grieving sister. She kept Ronald's favorite jacket exactly as it had been, hanging in her hall closet where she could see it every time she reached for her own coat. She made banana bread on the 23rd of every month, Ronald's favorite recipe, even though there was no one to eat it, and it usually ended up in the trash after a few days. Everything about her daily routine became oriented around her brother's memory, around the unanswered question of who had killed him and why they had never been caught. In the first months after Ronald's murder, this preservation felt like love, like keeping his memory alive in a world that seemed eager to move on to other tragedies and other news stories. But as 1984 became 1985 and then 1986, the unchanging rituals transformed from expressions of grief into monuments to loss. Janet's husband, Mark, began sleeping on the couch, unable to cope with his wife's middle-of-the-night crying sessions or her constant need to talk about Ronald's case. Their marriage, which had been solid and affectionate before Ronald's death, became a careful choreography of two people trying to grieve in the same house without acknowledging that their grief had taken incompatible forms. Janet's obsession expanded beyond the monthly rituals to include maintaining detailed files on every aspect of Ronald's case. She converted their spare bedroom into an informal command center, covering the walls with photocopies of police reports, timelines written in her increasingly erratic handwriting, and photographs of Ronald from every stage of his life. She corresponded with families of other murder victims across Iowa, creating a network of shared grief that offered support, but also reinforced her inability to move forward with her own life. The community's initial sympathy gradually gave way to uncomfortable avoidance. Janet's behavior at community events became unpredictable, sometimes involving tearful outbursts when someone mentioned Christmas or December 23rd. Other times, manifesting as inappropriate laughter when her mind wandered to some memory of Ronald's mischievous sense of humor. Friends stopped inviting her to social gatherings, not out of cruelty, but because her presence transformed every occasion into a reminder of unsolved violence and justice denied. Mark Wilson finally moved out in 1992, 8.5 years after Ronald's death. The official reason was irreconcilable differences, but everyone in their circle of friends understood that Mark was leaving because Janet had essentially died, along with her brother, in that frozen back room. Their divorce was finalized on June 12, 1993, exactly 1 week before what would have been Ronald's 34th birthday. Janet discovered the papers delivered to her empty house while she was visiting the cemetery, maintaining her weekly ritual of bringing fresh flowers to Ronald's grave. Detective Amy Rodriguez discovered the forgotten evidence box on a sweltering Thursday afternoon in July 2019, 36 years after Ronald Novak's murder. Rodriguez had been assigned to conduct an inventory of the Lynn County Sheriff's Department evidence storage facility as part of a department-wide effort to digitize old records and identify cases that might benefit from modern forensic techniques. The facility, located in a warehouse on the outskirts of Cedar Rapids, contained decades of evidence from thousands of cases, organized according to systems that had changed multiple times over the years. The NOVAK case file sat in a cardboard box that had been moved at least 5 times, judging by the various storage labels and location codes written in different handwriting styles across its surface. The box itself showed signs of age, its corners softened and edges frayed, but the evidence inside had been protected by plastic bags and careful documentation that reflected Detective Murphy's meticulous approach to crime scene processing. Rodriguez nearly overlooked it entirely, assuming it was just another routine case from the 1980s, until she opened the lid and saw the crime scene photographs of Ronald Novak's frozen body. When Rodriguez finally examined the evidence inventory, she found herself looking at a case that predated her law enforcement career by more than a decade. The original evidence list, typed on yellowed paper with a manual typewriter, whose lowercase e was slightly faded, listed 43 items collected during the initial investigation. Most were routine materials that had yielded no useful information at the time. Soil samples from outside the house, photographs of tire tracks that proved impossible to match, witness statements that led nowhere productive. But buried beneath layers of routine evidence bags and faded Polaroid photographs was something that made Rodriguez pause in the climate-controlled warehouse air. Evidence Bag 14 contained biological samples from the electrical cord used to bind Ronald's hands. The samples had been collected by Detective Murphy's team using techniques that were state-of-the-art in 1983, carefully swabbing surfaces and preserving materials in conditions that, while not ideal by modern standards, had prevented complete degradation. Under the magnification available in 1983, these samples had been identified as blood and tissue, presumably from both Ronald and his attacker, but the technology to analyze them properly simply hadn't existed when they were collected. Rodriguez found herself staring at evidence that had been waiting nearly 4 decades for forensic science to catch up with investigative theory. DNA analysis had become standard procedure in criminal investigations by 2019, and the techniques for extracting genetic material from aged biological samples were now sophisticated enough to work with evidence that would have been useless even 10 years earlier. The Iowa Division of Criminal Investigation had recently partnered with Othram Labs, a private company specializing in advanced DNA extraction and genetic genealogy, as part of a grant-funded initiative to work cold cases using cutting-edge technology. The fabric fragments and biological samples told a story that Murphy's team couldn't have read in 1983. Modern analysis revealed that the electrical cord contained skin cells from at least 2 different individuals, Ronald Novak himself and an unknown male whose DNA profile would become the key to solving the case. One sample, barely larger than a pinhead, showed what appeared to be epithelial cells, consistent with someone handling the cord with bare hands, leaving behind microscopic traces that 4 decades of storage hadn't completely destroyed. Rodriguez carefully photographed each piece of evidence before submitting the most promising samples to Othram Labs, according to updated chain of custody protocols. The warehouse storage, while not ideal, had actually helped preserve biological evidence through its consistent temperature and low humidity. She could feel the weight of possibility as she completed the paperwork, understanding that these forgotten fragments might contain answers that had eluded investigators for longer than she'd been alive. The breakthrough in Ronald Novak's case came from genetic genealogy, a revolutionary forensic technique that had only recently begun transforming cold case investigations. Dr. Rebecca Chen, the forensic genealogist assigned to the case by Othram Labs, explained to Rodriguez that the process resembled assembling a vast jigsaw puzzle where most pieces remained missing, but enough fragments existed to glimpse the complete picture. The unknown male DNA extracted from the electrical cord was too degraded to produce a complete profile for traditional CODIS database searching, but it contained enough genetic markers to attempt familial matching through genealogy databases. The process began with Othram Labs using advanced DNA sequencing technology to extract every possible genetic marker from the decades-old biological sample. This produced a partial DNA profile that, while insufficient for courtroom certainty on its own, could be compared against publicly available genealogy databases where millions of people had uploaded their genetic information to trace family trees and discover relatives. The comparison identified several distant cousins whose family trees, when analyzed by Dr. Chen's team, converged on common ancestors in Iowa and Wisconsin during the 1800s. Dr. Chen spent 6 weeks constructing what genealogists call mirror trees, building family networks around these genetic matches by cross-referencing birth records, marriage certificates, census data, and obituaries spanning 5 generations. Each branch of the family tree needed verification through multiple independent sources before investigators could consider potential suspects. The work required accessing archives from 4 states and coordinating with genealogy researchers who specialized in Midwestern family histories. The family tree analysis eventually narrowed the possibilities to a handful of men who would have been between 18 and 30 years old in 1983 and had some connection to eastern Iowa. Rodriguez found herself studying family photographs uploaded to ancestry websites, examining the faces of men who might have been in Ronald Novak's house on that frozen December night. The images created an eerie sensation of hunting for a killer among birthday parties, wedding celebrations, and holiday gatherings, where relatives smiled at cameras without knowing they were providing evidence for a murder investigation that wouldn't reach its conclusion for 4 decades. Michael Shapard emerged as the primary suspect through a combination of genetic analysis and biographical details that aligned disturbingly well with the crime's circumstances. Born in 1959, he would have been 24 years old during Ronald's murder, placing him within the age range that criminologists associate with this type of violent crime. His connection to the area came through employment records, showing he'd worked construction jobs in Lynn County during 1983, the same type of irregular work that Ronald Novak had done. More significantly, interviews with people who knew Shapard during that period revealed that he'd been part of the same social circles where marijuana was bought and sold, potentially providing a connection to Ronald's drug-dealing activities. The revelation that Shapard's family tree connected him to the DNA sample found on Ronald's binding cord created the probable cause that Rodriguez needed, but confirming his guilt required obtaining a direct DNA sample for comparison. Modern cold case investigations have developed techniques for collecting DNA from suspects without requiring their cooperation or even their awareness. Rodriguez initiated surveillance of Shapard, who now lived in Fairview, Oregon, had married, raised children, and worked as a facilities manager at a manufacturing plant, his life apparently untouched by the violence he'd committed as a young man. The surveillance photographs showed a man in his mid-60s, his face weathered by time, his movements suggesting the careful deliberation of someone dealing with aging joints and the accumulated weariness of decades. Shapard followed routines that made collecting a discarded DNA sample relatively straightforward. On May 15, 2025, investigators recovered a disposable coffee cup that Shapard had thrown away at a rest stop during his commute to work. The cup was carefully preserved and submitted to the Iowa DCI laboratory for analysis. The laboratory results arrived 2 weeks later, delivered by phone to Rodriguez, while she sat at her desk reviewing other case files. The DNA profile from Shapard's coffee cup matched the unknown male DNA from Ronald Novak's binding cord, with a probability of 1.7 trillion to 1. After 41 years of questions without answers, science had finally identified the person who had been in that house during Ronald's final hours. The revelation would shatter whatever comfortable existence Michael Shapard had built in Oregon. But first, Rodriguez had to coordinate with law enforcement there and build a case strong enough to survive defense challenges and the skepticism that always accompanies cold case prosecutions based on evidence 4 decades old. The arrest of Michael Shapard on May 29, 2025, brought an end to Janet Wilson's 41-year vigil, though not in the way she'd imagined during all those years of obsession and grief. Rodriguez had called Janet 2 days before the arrest, explaining in careful detail that DNA evidence had identified her brother's killer and that charges would be filed. Janet's first reaction was silence, so complete that Rodriguez initially thought the call had been disconnected. When Janet finally spoke, her voice carried emotions that seemed almost beyond expression. Relief, vindication, exhaustion, and a profound sadness that 41 years of her life had been defined by waiting for this moment. Janet was 67 years old now, her health compromised by decades of stress and the kind of grief that physically ages the body beyond its years. She had outlived both her parents, who died without ever knowing who killed their son. She had lost her marriage, many of her friendships, and countless opportunities for happiness because she couldn't let go of Ronald's case. Learning that Michael Shapard, a name she didn't even recognize, had murdered her brother during what investigators believed was a robbery that went wrong brought no real comfort, only a kind of hollow completion. The community's response to Shoppert's arrest was more muted than Rodriguez had expected. 4 decades had passed since Ronald Novak's murder, and most people who remembered the case were now elderly or had moved away. The younger generation knew nothing about the frozen crime scene on County Road 7 or the intensive investigation that had consumed law enforcement resources during the winter of 1983 to 1984. For them, Shoppert's arrest was just another news story about cold cases being solved through DNA technology, interesting but not personally meaningful. Michael Shoppert was extradited from Oregon to Iowa in June 2025 to face charges of first-degree murder. His initial court appearance drew a small crowd of reporters and true crime enthusiasts, but the proceedings were routine and brief. Shoppert, represented by a public defender from Cedar Rapids, entered a plea of not guilty, and his case was scheduled for trial pending additional investigation and evidence review. The investigation revealed that Shoppert had lived what appeared to be a normal life for 41 years, never arrested for violent crimes, never displaying the kind of behavior that would have drawn law enforcement attention to past actions. His family expressed shock at his arrest, insisting that the quiet man they knew couldn't possibly be responsible for the brutal murder described in news reports. But DNA doesn't lie, and the evidence connecting Shoppert to Ronald Novak's death was scientifically irrefutable. For Detective Rodriguez, solving the Novak case represented both professional triumph and a reminder of how many cold cases still sit in evidence warehouses across America, waiting for technology and resources that might never arrive. She attended Janet Wilson's visit to Ronald's grave after the arrest, standing at a respectful distance while the elderly woman finally had a conversation with her brother that included answers instead of just questions. If you've been following this decades-long search for truth, consider subscribing to see how forensic methods are finally providing answers to questions that have haunted families for generations. The resolution of Ronald Novak's case won't bring him back or restore the years that Janet Wilson lost to grief, but it proves that justice, however delayed, can still arrive through the patient work of investigators who refuse to let the dead be forgotten. The courtroom in Lynn County filled beyond capacity on the morning of November 8, 2025, when Michael Allen Shoppert stood before Judge Thomas Reynolds to answer for a murder committed 41 years earlier. Every seat had been claimed by 7:30 a.m., 2 hours before proceedings were scheduled to begin, and sheriff's deputies had to turn away overflow crowds who gathered in the hallway, hoping to witness the conclusion of a case that had haunted eastern Iowa for 4 decades. Janet Wilson sat in the front row, her weathered hands gripping a photograph of Ronald that she'd carried in her purse since 1983, the edges worn soft from decades of touching. The man who stood at the defense table bore little resemblance to the 24-year-old construction worker who had entered Ronald Novak's house on that frozen December night. Shoppert's gray hair was thinning, his shoulders curved with the weight of aging joints and 41 years of carrying a secret that had finally been exposed by microscopic traces of skin cells left on electrical cord. His public defender, Sarah Martinez, a 32-year-old attorney from Cedar Rapids, had counseled him extensively about the strength of the DNA evidence and the futility of mounting a defense based on denying his presence at the crime scene. The prosecution's case unfolded with the methodical precision of modern forensic science, translated for a jury that ranged in age from 23 to 67. Assistant District Attorney Jennifer Blake presented evidence that combined 1983 crime scene documentation with 2025 genetic analysis, creating a narrative that bridged 4 decades of technological advancement. The electrical cord that had bound Ronald's hands, carefully preserved in evidence storage, had yielded DNA profiles with probability ratios that made random chance statistically impossible. Blake's presentation included testimony from Dr. Rebecca Chen, whose forensic genealogy work had identified Shappert's family connections, and from Iowa DCI laboratory technicians, who explained extraction techniques that could recover genetic material from evidence that would have been useless even 10 years earlier. The most compelling testimony came from David Martinez, now 66 years old, who described discovering Ronald's body in that unheated back room. His voice broke multiple times as he recalled the frozen tableau that had haunted his dreams for over 4 decades. The way Ronald's bound hands had suggested helplessness and suffering that extended beyond the visible injuries. Martinez had never married, never left Lynn County, and had spent 41 years wondering if the killer he'd unknowingly encountered might still be living nearby. Learning that Shappert had been in Oregon the entire time provided no comfort, only confirmation that evil could successfully flee and hide for longer than most people lived. Detective Amy Rodriguez testified for 3 hours about the investigation that had ultimately connected a forgotten evidence box to a coffee cup discarded at an Oregon rest stop. Her description of the genetic genealogy process captivated jurors who seemed equally fascinated and disturbed by the implications of technology that could identify suspects through distant relatives who had never been involved in criminal activity. The defense's attempts to challenge the reliability of degraded DNA evidence foundered against expert testimony that patiently explained error rates, contamination protocols, and statistical probabilities that exceeded the number of humans who had ever lived on Earth. The prosecution's reconstruction of December 23, 1983, relied on physical evidence and investigative deduction rather than Shappert's confession, which his attorney had successfully excluded due to Miranda violations during the initial Oregon interrogation. Blake presented a scenario supported by crime scene analysis. Shappert had known Ronald through Eastern Iowa's network of drug dealers and occasional users, had been aware that Ronald kept cash and marijuana at his isolated house, and had arrived that December evening with intentions that escalated from robbery to murder when Ronald resisted or recognized his attacker. The electrical cord used to bind Ronald's hands had been purchased from a hardware store in Marion, Iowa, 3 days before the murder, traced through old receipt records that had somehow survived in the store's basement archives. The cord's distinctive green and white striping matched remnants found in Shappert's construction vehicle, documented in photographs taken during a 1984 traffic stop for an unrelated matter. These details, insignificant in isolation, accumulated into overwhelming evidence of premeditation and planning that contradicted defense suggestions of accidental confrontation. Janet Wilson's victim impact statement lasted 47 minutes, precisely the amount of time investigators estimated Ronald had suffered before dying. She described 41 years of suspended animation, of relationships destroyed by grief that couldn't be contained or processed, of holidays that became reminders of absence rather than celebrations of presence. Her voice remained steady as she detailed the basement bedroom she'd maintained exactly as Ronald had left it, the birthday cards she'd purchased every year on September 12th, and then stored unopened in boxes that now filled her attic, and the apology she owed her ex-husband Mark for choosing her dead brother over their living marriage. The defense's mitigation case attempted to present Shappert as a product of poverty, addiction, and impulsive decision-making, rather than as a calculating killer who had hidden successfully for 41 years. Witnesses described his work ethic in Oregon, his role as a father to 3 children who had never suspected their father's past, and his community involvement that mirrored Ronald's own participation in his Iowa community before his murder. But these testimonies seemed to strengthen the prosecution's case rather than weaken it, highlighting Shappert's ability to construct a normal life while Ronald remained frozen in time, forever 24 years old. Judge Reynolds delivered his sentence on November 22, 2025, 2 days before what would have been Ronald Novak's 66th birthday. Life imprisonment without possibility of parole reflected both the severity of the crime and the calculation required to evade justice for 4 decades. Reynolds' statement from the bench acknowledged that no sentence could restore the years Janet Wilson had lost to obsession, repair the marriage destroyed by unresolved grief, or give Ronald the chance to experience the life Shepard had lived while hiding in plain sight across state lines. The investigation's conclusion revealed additional victims beyond those present in the courtroom. Shepard's wife, Carol, who had believed she was married to a facilities manager with a clean past, filed for divorce within weeks of his arrest. Their 3 adult children released a joint statement expressing shock and sympathy for the Novak family, while requesting privacy to process the revelation that their father was someone they'd never actually known. The Oregon manufacturing plant where Shepard had worked for 18 years implemented new background check procedures, though several employees noted bitterly that 1983 crimes wouldn't have appeared in standard employment screenings. Detective Rodriguez received commendations from the Iowa Division of Criminal Investigation and recognition from national cold case organizations for her persistence in reviewing forgotten evidence boxes. But standing in her Cedar Rapids office after the sentencing, surrounded by files from dozens of other unsolved cases, she felt less triumph than exhaustion mixed with awareness of how many victims would never receive the answers that Janet Wilson had finally obtained. The Novak case had required perfect preservation of evidence, technological advances that didn't exist when the crime occurred, and the coincidental entry of a distant relative's DNA into a genealogy database. How many other cases lacked one or more of these elements? The recovery of Ronald Novak's belongings from the evidence storage facility provided Janet with tangible connections to her brother that she'd been denied for 41 years. The red and black flannel shirt he'd been wearing, carefully preserved despite bloodstains that forensic analysis had documented, became a relic that Janet held for hours in her living room, crying in ways she hadn't allowed herself during the decades when grief had to be channeled into investigation rather than mourning. The wallet that Ronald had carried, containing his driver's license photo and $37 in cash that the killer had somehow missed, returned to Janet the image of her brother's face before the crime scene photographs had replaced her memories of how he'd looked in life. The media coverage that followed Shepard's sentencing brought unwanted attention to Lynn County from true crime enthusiasts and amateur investigators who arrived seeking to explore locations connected to Ronald's case. The house on County Road 7 where he'd been murdered had changed ownership 6 times since 1983 and had been significantly renovated. But that didn't prevent curiosity seekers from parking on the shoulder and taking photographs that would appear in online forums devoted to discussing every detail of the investigation. Janet found herself dealing with interview requests from podcasters, documentary filmmakers, and authors who wanted to transform her family's tragedy into content for audiences who consumed cold cases as entertainment. The resolution of Ronald's murder created ripple effects throughout Iowa's network of unsolved cases. Families of other victims contacted Rodriguez and the Iowa DCI requesting that old evidence be re-examined using the same advanced DNA techniques that had identified Shepard. The backlog of cases requiring review quickly overwhelmed available resources, forcing painful decisions about which investigations would receive priority and which would continue waiting for funding and attention that might never materialize. Janet Wilson's first visit to Ronald's grave after Shepard's sentencing occurred on a gray afternoon in early December 2025, nearly 42 years after the murder. She brought fresh flowers and a printout of the sentencing statement, reading Judge Reynolds's words aloud to a headstone that had been her constant companion through 4 decades of unanswered questions. The cemetery was empty, except for a groundskeeper working several rows away, providing the privacy Janet needed to finally have a conversation with her brother that included resolution rather than just desperate pleas for guidance about where to search next. Detective Rodriguez attended Janet's cemetery visit, standing at a respectful distance, while the elderly woman knelt in the frozen grass beside Ronald's grave. The detective had solved the case that defined her career, identified a killer who had successfully hidden for longer than many investigators worked before retirement, and provided answers to a family that had suffered beyond what most people could imagine enduring. But watching Janet Wilson finally grieve without the burden of investigation, Rodriguez understood that justice, however necessary and important, couldn't restore what had been stolen or repair the damage that 41 years of waiting had inflicted on everyone connected to Ronald Novak's story. The Lynn County Sheriff's Department held a small ceremony in January 2026 to officially close the Novak case file, transferring it from active investigation to solved homicide in a transition that required updating databases and reorganizing physical storage systems. The ceremony included recognition for Detective Murphy, who had died in 2018 without knowing that his meticulous evidence collection in 1983 would ultimately solve the case he'd worked so desperately to crack. Murphy's widow attended the event, accepting a commendation that acknowledged her husband's foundational work in an investigation that had spanned 2 generations of law enforcement. For Janet Wilson, the resolution of her brother's murder brought complications that she hadn't anticipated during the 41 years when investigation provided structure and purpose to her daily existence. The basement room that had served as her investigative headquarters for 4 decades now felt like a mausoleum filled with evidence of obsession rather than dedication. She began the slow process of dismantling her files, donating relevant materials to the Iowa Cold Case database, while discarding the countless dead ends and false leads that had consumed thousands of hours of research and investigation. Janet's therapy sessions, which she'd finally agreed to attend at Rodriguez's urging, focused on rebuilding an identity separate from her role as Ronald's sister and advocate. At 67 years old, she faced the challenge of constructing a life based on something other than grief and investigation, of forming relationships that weren't defined by her brother's murder, and of finding purposes that could provide meaning without requiring the constant adrenaline of searching for answers. The work was harder than anything she'd done during the previous 41 years, requiring her to confront the person she'd become rather than the sister she'd lost. The true crime community's fascination with Ronald Novak's case illustrated both the public's appetite for cold case resolutions and the ethical complications of consuming real tragedies as entertainment. Online forums dissected every detail of the investigation, debating evidence, interpretation, and creating elaborate timelines that treated Janet's suffering as material for speculation, rather than as the lived experience of a woman whose life had been destroyed by violence and absence. Several podcasts devoted multiple episodes to the case, featuring interviews with people who had minimal connection to Ronald, but who provided the kind of dramatic content that attracted listeners and advertising revenue. Detective Rodriguez found herself navigating the uncomfortable intersection of public interest and victim privacy, fielding media requests while trying to protect Janet from exploitation by content creators who cared more about engagement metrics than about the human cost of the story they were telling. The detective's refusal to provide certain details about the crime scene and investigation frustrated journalists who demanded complete access in the name of public interest. But Rodriguez understood that some information served no purpose except to satisfy morbid curiosity that should never be confused with legitimate journalistic inquiry. The resolution of the Novak case prompted discussions within law enforcement about evidence preservation protocols and the potential value of maintaining biological samples even when current technology couldn't analyze them effectively. The Iowa Division of Criminal Investigation implemented new guidelines requiring long-term storage of all biological evidence from violent crimes, regardless of whether immediate analysis was possible, based on the recognition that future technological advances might eventually extract information from samples that appeared worthless under current capabilities. Michael Shappert's incarceration at the Iowa State Penitentiary in Fort Madison placed him in a specialized unit for elderly inmates whose medical needs and security risk assessments differed from the general population. His daily routine consisted of medical appointments, limited recreation time, and the crushing awareness that he would die in prison having spent more time incarcerated than he'd spent free after murdering Ronald Novak. Prison psychologists documented his gradual decline into depression and acceptance, noting that relief mixed with his remorse, as if finally being caught, had lifted a psychological burden that had grown heavier with each passing year. Janet Wilson's decision to meet with Shappert in prison, arranged through Victim Advocate Services 6 months after his sentencing, surprised even her therapist, who had been working with her on processing grief without requiring confrontation. The meeting took place in a small conference room, monitored by guards, and recorded for Janet's protection and Shappert's legal documentation. Facing the man who had killed her brother and inadvertently destroyed her life required courage that Janet hadn't known she possessed, but she needed to ask questions that only Shappert could answer about Ronald's final moments and whether he had suffered in ways beyond what crime scene evidence revealed. Shappert's answers, delivered in the flat effect of someone who had nothing left to lose or protect, confirmed Janet's worst fears, while simultaneously providing the detailed closure she'd sought for 41 years. Ronald had been conscious when Shappert bound his hands, had begged for his life, and had died slowly from shock and hypothermia in that unheated back room while his killer fled into a December night that had hidden his escape. The cruelty of these details competed with Janet's need to know the truth, creating a psychological complexity that her therapist would help her process over many subsequent sessions. The meeting concluded with Shappert's apology, words that could never repair the damage or restore the years, but which Janet needed to hear spoken directly by the person responsible. His acknowledgement of the devastation he'd caused, of the life he'd stolen from Ronald, and the decades he'd stolen from Ronald's family through his successful evasion of justice, provided a form of accountability that legal proceedings couldn't fully deliver. Janet left the prison with no sense of forgiveness or closure in the conventional sense, but with the confirmation that Shappert understood exactly what he'd done and would spend his remaining years carrying that knowledge in a cell where escape was finally impossible. The media attention surrounding the Novak case gradually faded as news stories claimed headlines and public interest moved on to more recent tragedies. The brief period when Ronald's name appeared in national news coverage gave way to the familiar obscurity that characterized most cold case victims once their stories had been told and their killers sentenced. For Janet, this return to anonymity brought relief mixed with the ironic awareness that she'd spent 41 years trying to keep Ronald's case in public consciousness, only to feel exhausted by attention when it finally arrived. Detective Rodriguez continued working cold cases for the Lynn County Sheriff's Department, applying lessons learned from the Novak investigation to other forgotten evidence boxes that lined the storage facility's shelves. Each case represented another family, suspended in the same devastating uncertainty that had defined Janet Wilson's existence. Another victim whose story deserved the same persistent attention that had ultimately solved Ronald's murder. The work remained difficult and often frustrating, but the Novak case had proven that persistence, combined with advancing technology, could occasionally produce miracles that seemed impossible when crimes were initially committed. The annual memorial service that Janet had conducted alone for so many years transformed into a small community gathering after Shappert's conviction, attended by Rodriguez, several retired investigators who had worked Ronald's case over the decades, and a handful of true crime advocates who approached cold case victims with genuine respect rather than voyeuristic curiosity. The December 23rd remembrance became less about desperate pleading for answers and more about honoring Ronald's life beyond the violence that had ended it, celebrating the brother Janet remembered from before, that frozen night, rather than the victim whose murder had consumed her adult existence. Janet's gradual healing process included reconnecting with her ex-husband Mark, who had remarried but maintained concern for the woman he'd once loved before grief transformed her into someone he couldn't reach. Their careful friendship, built on decades of shared history and the acknowledgement of damage that couldn't be undone, provided Janet with human connection that wasn't defined entirely by Ronald's murder. Mark's willingness to listen to her process, Shoppert's conviction without judgment or advice, helped Janet understand how thoroughly her obsession had isolated her from people who might have supported her journey if she'd been able to accept help during those decades of solitary investigation. The resolution of Ronald Novak's case represented both an ending and a beginning for everyone it had touched. For Janet Wilson, it meant slowly constructing an identity separate from her role as a grieving sister and obsessed investigator, learning at 67 to build a life that acknowledged her loss without being defined entirely by it. For Detective Rodriguez, it meant understanding that cold case work required accepting that most investigations wouldn't produce the miraculous breakthroughs that had solved this one, that families would continue suffering without answers, and that doing the work remained worthwhile even when success seemed impossible. If you've been following Ronald Novak's story from that frozen December night in 1983 through 41 years of investigation to Michael Shoppert's conviction in 2025, you've witnessed how modern forensic science is finally providing answers to questions that seemed permanently unanswerable when the crimes were committed. The resolution won't restore Ronald's life or return the decades that Janet lost to grief and investigation, but it proves that justice, however delayed, can still arrive through the patient work of investigators who refuse to let the dead be forgotten. For other families still waiting for answers about their own cold cases, Ronald's story offers both hope that advancing technology might eventually solve their mysteries and the sobering acknowledgement that such solutions depend on preserved evidence, adequate funding, and the kind of investigative persistence that many departments struggling with limited resources simply cannot maintain across decades of waiting.